Hey, welcome back everyone to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a slightly different video. We have a special guest here, Will, who is currently running what I believe to be is the #1 ranked set and forget team in the world for this FPL 24-25 season. Well, welcome, Will.
Thank you.
So do you want to give us a bit of an introduction as to your playing history and I guess also specifically how long you've been playing this sort of set and forget style of play of FPL?
Yeah, I've been playing Fantasy Premier League about 10 or 11 years. I got into it through friends of mine who I hung out with on a Saturday evening in a pub. I used to sit there chatting about Fantasy Premier League. I'm not someone that closely follows football, but for a number of seasons, they kept goading me to say, come on, you should play. And I'm of the type of person that I'm not going to play and not take it quite seriously. They are both Aston Villa fans. And I had a bit of a theory that them actually being fans of specific teams and underlying clubs probably led to them not always making the best decisions. So I decided to test my theory out and join up and start playing against them, playing a regular game of Fantasy Premier League. And I've had some decent results. I've been playing probably about 10 or 11 years and have finished maybe top 10K, top 20K a couple of times, normally top 100, 200K overall. Unfortunately, this season not doing quite as well with that team. I'm only 1.5 million in the world with that team at the moment. But the one we're here to talk about today is a set and forget team that I started playing about 6 years ago. I frequent the Reddit Fantasy Premier League subreddit, and there was somebody there that had put together a Reddit set and forget league, which I joined. The rules of which you pick your squad of players, you set your captains, and then you don't touch it. And you don't touch it all season. And you see how it goes. And yeah, it's about 6 years I've been doing that for, with real mixed results. Most seasons I end up with some injuries or some players transferred out, or different things happen, or just bad picks. And I think the best that has done overall was about 600,000 in the world a number of years ago. But it was brought to my attention in game week 27 of this week that I was #1 in the set and forget teams around the world. And I think that's still true now. So I seem to have got the right squad of players at the beginning of this season, and fingers crossed they keep doing well through to the end of the year.
Okay, wonderful. So I think with the set and forget aspect of the game, do you want to just sort of detail how you usually go about making your team in game week 1 at the start of the season?
Yeah. So I like the underlying data of Premier League, of Fantasy Premier League. What I do is I go look at, essentially I'm playing Moneyball. I'm looking at how to maximize the amount of points per $1 million spent for players on the pitch. And the metric I find most useful is VAPM, value added per million. It's a metric that looks at how many points you essentially get per $1 million spent on different players. And it leads certain players in certain positions to stand out as being really good value. And it leads you to a bit more insight, in my mind, into who should be a decent pick based on previous performance throughout that next season. So what I did at the beginning of this year is I look on Reddit, is the main source of lots of my data. I find one of the content creators or posters there that's analyzed the previous season's performance of all the different players, and then ran these VAPM calculations based upon the New Year's pricing for the players in the 2024-25 season this year. I then do a bit of filtering, and I filter out players that don't get enough minutes or don't get enough starts, or I think might be injury prone or might get transferred out. I also then use a bit of estimation because, of course, as with stocks and shares, previous performance doesn't guarantee future outcomes. So look at who I think are going to have the best underlying stats from previous seasons as well. And it leads certain players and certain types of decision-making to kind of rise to the top. I'll then go through the various different positions, goalkeepers, defenders, midfielders, and forwards, and I'll look at where I should be spending the most money. I'll look at which players in particular stand out and which ones look like really solid picks. One of the things that the VAPM thought process leads you towards is it quickly highlights that the really premium players, Haaland, Palmer, Salah, they aren't actually very good value for money. So you can't afford many of them. They only actually come into their own when you captain them. And given it's set and forget, I can only captain one of them. So it's only really worth having one of those players on the squad. So that's the kind of logic you have to apply and kind of the direction you have to take things.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Do you also happen to use, as part of the estimation, a lot of maybe predicted models as well, and then look at maybe projected market data at the start of season, things like that? Or how do you consume content around those spheres?
So when I set out talking to these friends in the pub and they're trying to make me play fancy Premier League, and I know very little about it, my decision at the time was that I was going to rely on third-party data aggregators. I wasn't going to go and get all the data myself. In my professional life, I work with a lot of data, but I'm not a data analyst, I'm not a data scientist. So I trust other people to do the analysis. Most of the data I get tends to come from social media posts, from content creators like you, Fran, for the regular team that I'm playing. I do use my regular team, Fancy Football Hub, and I will have used that when I came to picking my set and forget squad this year as well. But I'm using it in different ways than most people are. You know, I'm interested in that underlying data, but I've got no interest in form or fixtures. I'm looking only at, over the course of the next 38 game weeks, how many points are these players going to contribute to my squad? And given that value added per million metric again, it only counts for the players on the field. So you've got to get as much of that on the actual pitch any one game week. So it's a real mix then of looking for solid performers who we know will do well over multiple, because they've done well over multiple previous seasons, and who we know will then have a very good chance of continuing to do well this season. You have to avoid ones that are prone to injury. I'm sure I'm not the only one in my main squad that's had players like James and others in there before to only keep finding them get injured many times. You can't afford that in a set and forget squad. You've just got to get some real solid performers who have low injury likelihood and who get lots of minutes.
I think this is a good time to jump into the squad as well. So do you want to go about how you selected position by position, or which players came into your squad first?
Yeah, so maybe I think position by position is a good one. I think defenders, kind of logically from my perspective, as where I start. I'm a fan and have been a fan historically of kind of the big at the back theory with defenders. I have generally chosen to have premium defenders on the logic that a $6 or $7 million defender will get you a lot more points than a $6 or $7 million midfielder or forward typically will. So the core of my defense is Alexander-Arnold, is Gabriel, and is Gaudiol. So they're the three that kind of make up the backbone of the defenders. I then have to look at who else I want. I have to look at then who's going to be my first sub for a defender. So I want someone that's going to perform. I want someone that's going to stand a chance of not just getting some clean sheets, but also getting some attacking returns as well. And off the back of the preseason this year, one player that stood out was Hall. He'd had some decent performance in the preseason. We all know that Newcastle are going to get some clean sheets. We don't know quite how many, but we know they'll do all right. So Hall was my first substitute. And then Barco was my second substitute. At the beginning of this season, at the $4 million price point, I think he played a few games, and the general consensus was that he was going to be the best performing or the safest bet in those 4 million defenders. So that gave him a 5-defender lineup. Unsurprisingly, my strategy was to run 3-4-3 combination on the match. So I think having those two solid subs of Hall and Barco was a logical choice.
One question I wanted to ask is you just mentioned the 3-4-3. So we knew that there were some bonus point changes this season. I think they've probably favored the strikers the most. Was that something that you thought about or had kind of estimated as well?
Yeah, I did. But the 3 players that I planned on fielding each week should get attacking returns as well and should get plenty of minutes. I'd had Gaudiol at the end of last season, and he'd done really well for me. So I probably had some bias. The thing about this, right? This is a story about looking at underlying data and making some solid decisions based upon that underlying data. But I still have biases, right? I still sat there and did well off Gaudiol at the end of last season, and gained lots of ranks relative to friends of mine. I'm like, yeah, he's going to make my set and forget squad this year because I think he's going to do well. So I'm guilty of all the same kind of biases that everyone else ends up becoming guilty of. Whereas players like Alexander-Arnold and Gabriel, it's like, we know they're solid choices. As long as they don't get long-term injuries, we know they're going to do all right. Whether Alexander-Arnold will quite justify his price point or not, it's hard to say. You know, he was expensive. but he's going to play all the minutes. He's going to get some attacking returns. He's going to get as many clean sheets as anyone. So he's a solid choice from that perspective.
Interesting. And maybe just going back a step in terms of positions. So the goalkeepers, was there any? I guess from a value perspective, maybe a lot of the cheaper goalkeepers from let's say teams that tend to concede much more, like your West Ham, for example, with your goalkeeper pairing here, they provide a lot more value than defenders just from the saves aspect and things like that. Was there like a conscious decision to spend as little as possible with the goalkeepers, or was it also just a case of price point?
So I didn't choose the goalkeepers until I'd really picked the rest of the squad, because I wanted two goalkeepers from the same team. I wanted one at 4.5 million and one at 4 million. So I wanted that combination. I didn't want to spend more than 8.5 million on the goalkeeper positions. So I needed to make sure, after I looked at the rest of the team, which of the Premier League teams I would still have two positions I could take a goalkeeper from. So in the end, I went with Areola and Fabianski as my two goalkeepers. That was probably the biggest or the worst decision I've made this season for the set and forget squad. They really haven't performed as well as you want to. But from a logic perspective, I think I learned in my second or third season playing Fantasy Premier League, it really doesn't make sense from a finance perspective to rotate goalkeepers. In my first couple of seasons, I was rotating based on fixtures and home and away and all different things. And I got it wrong as often as I got it right. So I stopped doing that completely. And religiously now we'll always have one $4 million goalkeeper as essentially bench fodder. It's just not worth having a second goalkeeper with any money in it, in my mind.
No, I think that's fair. And I think as someone who kind of consumes a lot of projected data myself, I tend to find that the value of a goalkeeper is very close from the top of the table to the bottom, regardless of the amount of clean sheets that certain goalkeepers get. And it's so hard, I think, especially from a prediction point of view, to actually get it right, goalkeepers compared to other positions. So I think what we've found historically is that goalkeeper sort of points estimations from any sort of model source is probably the least correlative. So my point of view from that is always, I like spending as little as possible in goalkeepers. But then at the same point of view, I know a lot of managers who still are totally comfortable with going with the likes of Ederson, Raya, because there is still that sort of intrinsic value of clean sheets and knowing that a team like Arsenal can produce. But as we've seen this season as well, a team like City can disappoint quite aggressively. So yeah, I think I don't really mind the choice of Areola and Fabianski. It's probably been a bit unfortunate, I suppose, that West Ham have performed as poorly as they have. I can't imagine many people would have thought they would have posted such poor numbers. And I think the positive, I would say, is since Potter's come in, that's probably been a bit of a correction in terms of West Ham's underlying data. So hopefully that pans out quite well for your goalkeeper pair for the rest of the season.
The thing about the goalkeepers is there's real value to be had by having the right £4.5 million goalkeeper.
Yeah.
But it's just so hard to know who that's going to be before the season starts. A slight aside, had I picked Sells instead of Areola, last game week I'd have been second in the world overall rank. Had I made that one simple, different decision earlier in the season. It's academic. I never even considered Sells, right? But it's one of those things that a small misstep like that can make quite a big difference. But the principle of having a 4.5 and 4 million, I think, is completely right. You just don't know which 4.5 is going to perform until the season starts.
That's fair. All right. Should we shift gears towards the midfield?
Yep.
I think so. We spoke previously actually about this, and I think you were very clear already at the start with how you approach the premiums. But did it take you long to get towards Mo Salah being your perma captain? Was there any consideration towards Palmer, Saka, Haaland at the start of the season?
There was certainly consideration. I looked at, I have a very strong believer that I can only justify having one of these ultra premiums in there. So I looked at what the whole squad looks like based upon the different premiums in the game. I didn't really have the confidence in Palmer as being someone that should be the only premium in my squad. All right, he had an amazing season last year, but that was really his breakout season in my mind. And I didn't have the confidence he was necessarily going to repeat that this season. And even if he did, I didn't take it for granted he'd be as good value as obviously he was last year at a much higher price point. I then looked at what the squad would look like with Haaland instead of Salah. But that difference in price point, what was Haaland, 15 million beginning of the season, a couple of million different than Salah. It just weakened the rest of the squad so much The way that I think you do well in set and forget is by having some of these kind of $6 to $8 million players in your squad and allowing them to go out there and perform. And you need enough of those players out there in order to kind of make the game work. If you have too many players at the 4.5, 5.5, 6.5 million level, they're going to get rotated. They're not going to be as consistent as the players a tier above them. So my strategy is to really try and fill the midfield and the forwards with as many of those kind of $6.5 to $8.5 million players as I can. And that led me towards Salah as being my premium pick. As you say, in the rules of set and forget, you stick to one captain. You can't change who the captain is. So Salah is my perma captain for the year. I've got lucky, much as Areola might not have performed, Salah has performed. So, him being a captain has stood me in really good stead. All of us will joke about this with our mates, though, right? Don't overthink these things. In fact, you know it best of all, Fran, right? Don't overthink these things. Just captain Salah, right? It's so easy to overthink some of this stuff. So with set and forget, that luxury of overthinking is taken away from you, and that was obviously the right choice. So yeah, Salah's my captain. He's what the squad's built around. And then the rest of the midfield is made up of Rodgers, Mabueno, Fernandez, and Bowen. And there's a few players there that I think really stand out or stood out at the beginning of the season and has turned out to be correct. Players like Fernandez and Bowen in particular, Bruno and Bowen, they're such solid performers. I know you're a big fan of Bruno. From a set and forget perspective, he's just going to do well. All right, United haven't done as well as they would like to this season, but so many of the attacking returns come through him, so many set pieces. He's just a quality player, particularly from a set and forget perspective. But Bowen, on the other hand, I think he gets talked about less, but he's such good value for money. He just sits there and performs and consistently gets points and is just a really nice player from a set and forget perspective. So I think, again, he's always a really good choice for FPL, particularly this type of way of playing it. I think Mabueno, I got a bit lucky. He showed promise in the preseason, which is, why he made my squad. We knew that he should be a really important player for the team, and that's turned out to be correct. And then Rodgers was my first sub. He was the first player on the bench. So whenever I do have an injury or something else happen, he's the first guy off the bench again. And again, he's performed. It's what you're looking for in this type of style of play, I think.
Absolutely. I think on the note with Bowen and Bruno and even Mbumo, it's just really that they actually do play 95 minutes. I think I'm someone who tends to sort of promote a lot of per 90 data. And I think the point that a lot of people do miss sometimes is not everyone plays 90 minutes. And that is sort of very underappreciated, how often Bowen and Bruno, even with niggling injuries, how fast they come back to play, how often they still play those 95 minutes and what that can produce as well when you play, I don't know, the additional 5 minutes of extra time sometimes as well. And yeah, absolutely great picks. Bowen's an interesting one, I think, where unfortunately West Ham have probably collectively underperformed against our expectations. So he's someone who's suffered a bit more because he doesn't have penalties all the time, right? It depends on also that sort of ongoing case with Paquetá, but also I think set pieces is something he doesn't quite have, whereas Mbumo has all of them. But Bowen has always impressed me because I think when you look at underlyings, he's always been a midfielder who has really, really good XG per 90 compared to most of his peers. And unfortunately, just with West Ham's underperformance in terms of attack this season, it hasn't been exactly the case. But as you were saying, he still is a guarantee to play. And there's so many midfielders who've kind of fallen by the wayside because their minutes sort of fall down the pecking order and things like that. So I think that's always good value when you make an SNF type of team. Shall we move on to the forwards potentially? I would like to just jump straight into, I guess, how you picked Chris Wood at the start of the season, and was there any sort of considerations of other strikers as well before you got to him?
He was probably the remaining slot after I'd chosen my other two strikers. So my other two being Watkins and Isaac. Watkins and Isaac, they're no-brainers, right? They're just high-performing players. They're always going to score goals. They're always going to get assists. They're always going to get plenty of playing time. I know Watkins might have a bit of a knock at the moment, but they're both going to get plenty of minutes. They're not prone to injury, which left me a spare slot. I certainly had no insight into expecting Forest to do as well as they have done this season. If I did, I'd have had a Forest defender in my squad. But I come from Burnley. I'm from Burnley originally, and obviously Wood was a Burnley attacker for quite a long time, so it was in my consciousness for quite a long time then. I chatted about him to a friend before the beginning of the season, and he was saying, "Oh, he's getting a bit old. Is he going to perform still this season?" But my bet was that Forest wouldn't perform as they had, but every goal they got would go through him. Every time they do perform, it will go through him, and he should get the minutes. Saying things like he should get the minutes, I look like a smart guy right now because he has got the minutes, but there's obviously scenarios and ways this could go where he might have underperformed and his position might have been more under threat and different things could happen. But obviously he's been a superstar. He's done really well. He's scored a lot of points, and he's been a great pick. He'll be in my set and forget team again next year, I expect. It's just a solid pick. I forget where his price started beginning of the year. Was he 6 million or 5.5? I'm not sure, but just such good value for money. But my logic for bringing him in was that so many of the points that Forest do score will go through him.
That's fair. Did you think he was on penalties as well at the start of the season?
I don't remember explicitly, but my analysis was quite straightforward. He's someone that does get points. He's someone that does get good attacking returns. He's someone that should play plenty of minutes, and he was priced correctly. So again, from a value added per million perspective, he looked like he should be a decent choice. I think he'd done quite well. I forget what his performance was last season, but I think he'd done well.
Yeah, he was great.
The previous season again. Yeah. So, it's a funny question you asked, Fran, right? About set pieces. My data analytical way of playing this game, I don't worry that much whether they're on set pieces because the data doesn't care if they're on set pieces. The data just says they get this many points per minute they're on the pitch, per million they cost. So that's more the metric that I'm looking at. I do end up learning who's on set pieces and knowing what's happening in a bit more detail. But the gist of how I make these decisions is just based upon the actual metrics of output. And if they score points through being on set pieces or doing whatever they do, it doesn't really matter to me. So I don't necessarily get too bogged down in that detail of whether they are or aren't on set pieces or whether they're on the left wing or the right wing or whatever else. It doesn't really matter to me. The data's not that interested in that.
That's fair. I think the only point I would contend, though, is that when you are on set pieces, that usually leads to future expectations, like an improvement in future expectations. Whereas obviously the point on whether you play on the left or right wing, I think I'll agree to that because I don't think there's any data suggesting that a lot of the zonal data outputs that we see are actually correlated to anything. But when it comes to set pieces, I will probably step in there and say it is quite important, but I think with Wood, the pro is, I think he's probably had 2 penalties or 3 penalties this season. So that's like points that a lot of people might not have priced in. Because I remember last season, a lot of people thought Morgan Gibbs-White would stay on penalties over Chris Wood.
Yeah.
And then those kind of things add up to 15, 20 points over the course of the season sometimes.
So I agree with you that it matters if we have a difference in expectation leading to someone potentially being mispriced. And that's something I'm very interested in. I want to take advantage of misprice in my favor. I want to avoid mispricing when it goes against me. The point I'm really making is subject to not being mispriced and subject to the previous performance to being a good indicator of where we expect this season to be. Then as to how he achieved what he did last season, how he's going to achieve this season, that's the nuance I'm not as focused on. I'm more interested in that consistency and will they do the same as they did before? And is there a reason to think that they won't? And most of that data I'm getting from content providers like you, from Reddit. I will normally find a data source on Reddit at the beginning of the season of someone that's done all this analysis already and coming up with some of these recommendations. And I then really do some meta-analysis of these different other third-party data sources to try and come up with what I think the right answer is, which leads me to things like Wood without necessarily having that insight as to whether he is or isn't on set pieces.
Well, no, I think that's totally fair because if you've already identified Wood as being good value and then he actually has more value added, I suppose, as the season goes on, then it just shows you how we can look into picks and maybe not make a misstep, I suppose, in the future. In terms of set and forget, I guess, is this your best season so far? And do you see yourself continuing to play in a set and forget way, given the highs of the season?
Yeah, it's by far my best season. I think on game week 19, I was at 1600 in the world with set and forget, but game week 19 felt far too early in the year to think that was anything good. Game week 28, so a week ago, I was at 2600 in the world. That 2600 is where I realized, oh, this is going surprisingly well. It was a poster on Reddit the week before that had said I was #1 overall. So yeah, I really enjoy this way of playing. I will keep playing this way. However, normally I forget about it. Normally within 8 or 10 weeks of the season starting, I barely ever log in to see how the set and forget team's doing, because I'll have 2 players transferred to Seville. I'll have someone with a long-term injury. I'll have picked the wrong captain, and it'll be at 8 million in the world, and I'll not pay a lot of attention to it. It's this season where it's done well that it's amused me. I do play a traditional game as well. I do have a regular squad, and I have my own little mini league of my set and forget team against my main squad. And of course, my set and forget team is romping away and thrashing my main squad. So I really enjoy the traditional game of FPL. I make all the same questionable decisions that most other people make. I make wild punts. I make the wrong calls. I have emotional attachment to things. I do all sorts of things wrong, like most people do in the traditional game. But it's a game and it's there to be played. So I don't bring that same mindset to the traditional way of to my normal team as I do the set and forget team. I joke with friends about, I think we all understand this, right? We question how much our tinkering helps. We sit there and say, oh, I shouldn't have transferred that player out. If I'd kept the other player, I'd have been 6 points better off this week, whatever it might be. This is really me taking that to the extreme of saying, if you don't touch your squad at all, can you do better? And normally the answer is no. Normally I can do better by playing the game traditionally. This season I've picked the right players in the set and forget squad. So I'll keep doing it. I very much enjoy it. If there's a bigger set and forget league, I'd enjoy being part of that again. But I play both games. They're both fun, and I play in slightly different mindsets.
Totally fair. Is this your first season where your set and forget team would have outperformed your main team?
It's the first one where it outperforms it at the end of the season, and it's going to outperform it at the end of the season. There's no way I'm catching up. At Christmas, I looked at both the teams and said, oh, well, maybe by Easter I'll be able to catch up. Yeah, not a chance. Yeah, so it's the first time it's outperformed it for more than maybe the first 6 or 8 weeks. Like I say, normally something goes wrong. Normally you have a long-term injury or something else that happens that just tanks the set and forget team. I try to take some lessons from set and forget. I try to tinker a bit less. I try to pick quality and consistency over form or fixtures, but I'm definitely a long way from perfect at how I implement that.
I'm interested in that. So do you still care about form and fixtures? Do you still prioritize one over the other for, let's say, your main team even?
Yeah, I do. And it's a mistake a lot of the time, but I do. I sit there and look at a player that's just transferred in that's had 2 decent weeks and think, oh, I should jump on him before he gets a price rise and before whatever happens. And in reality, I'm making decisions where there really isn't enough underlying data to make those decisions. In the next breath, I don't care. It's a game. I enjoy playing the game that way around as well. But I do have to concede, if you actually want to do really well at this game, I think being a lot more conservative, I think looking at underlying quality over form and fixtures makes a big difference. I think looking at the time proven players, often is the right way to look at some of these things and the right way to do well. But like I say, it's a game. I'm my traditional FPL game. I play with wild abandon and make poor decisions and get all sorts of things wrong and take hits when I shouldn't and all of those foolish things. And I wouldn't have it any other way. That's what it's here for, right? It's just amusing and entertaining when you have a set and forget team like this that can do quite as well as it has.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And I think the beauty of FPL is you can approach it so many different ways, which, playing a set and forget is one of those. Any maybe closing thoughts in terms of anything you want to leave for our viewers?
No, I don't think so. I'd say thank you to you, Fran. I enjoy your content for my regular set and forget squad. I think the underlying data of how we make these decisions, whether it's planned, whether it's strategic, or whether it is impulsive, is still an interesting way to play the game. I'm a big fan of the Reddit FPL community. You often find me over there on things. But no, good luck, everyone. Enjoy the game. I hope your seasons end well.